That line could stand on its own, but when you hold it up against the way religion talks about devotion, it becomes an even sharper mirror. One of the most common messages heard in churches, sermons, and religious conversations is this idea: you should serve God because He saved you. The wording changes from place to place, but the core logic stays the same. You owe obedience, loyalty, and even your very life because of what was supposedly done on your behalf. And the more you think about it, the more this sounds less like love and more like a trap. At first glance, it's presented as a simple exchange. God gave you salvation, so naturally you owe Him service. It's painted as gratitude, almost like when a friend helps you move into your apartment and you buy them dinner as a thank you. But that comparison falls apart the moment you really press on it. Because in everyday life, genuine gratitude is voluntary. It only means something when it's free. The second someone tells you that you must be grateful, that you must repay them in a specific way, the gratitude disappears. It's no longer a gift, it's leverage. This is where the phrase, serve Him because He saved you, reveals its toxicity. It confuses love with debt, kindness with obligation. It tries to transform a supposed act of generosity into an eternal chain of servitude. And worse, it plays with human psychology in ways that have long been studied. Psychologists talk about what's called the rule of reciprocity. Humans, across all cultures, feel a natural pull to return favors. It's one of the oldest social instincts. If someone gives you something, you feel an almost automatic push to give something back. It's part of how human cooperation developed. But here's the key. When that instinct is exploited, it becomes manipulation. Salespeople use it when they give you a free sample, knowing you'll feel nudged to buy something. Cult leaders use it when they shower new recruits with affection and attention, then demand loyalty. And religions use it when they present the story of salvation as an unpayable gift. Because what happens when the gift isn't really optional? In Christianity, the story is that God sacrificed His Son to save humanity. But notice the setup. First, you are told you are guilty, broken, condemned, born into sin. The problem is defined for you before you've even taken a breath. Then, the solution is offered: salvation. And now, because this solution is presented as undeserved mercy, you're told you must spend your life serving the giver. That's not a gift. That's a psychological contract written without your consent. In everyday life, if someone poisoned your drink and then handed you the antidote, would you call them a savior? Or would you recognize that they created the danger in the first place? Yet, that's exactly the structure here. You're born into a system that declares you condemned, then told to bow forever to the one who arranged the rescue. It's not grace, it's manufactured dependency. And when dependency is created, control follows. The logic of serve Him because He saved you isn't just about gratitude, it's about obedience. It says that the only proper response to this supposed salvation is total submission. No questions, no limits. The moment you hesitate, the moment you don't show enough loyalty, the same story is used against you. If you really understood what was done for you, wouldn't you devote yourself fully? If you don't devote yourself, maybe you're not truly grateful. Maybe you're rejecting the gift. And that threat hangs in the background like a shadow. What looks on the surface like love is really pressure. A transaction you didn't agree to, wrapped in the language of devotion. And the longer people sit inside that logic, the harder it becomes to see it clearly. Because once the rule of reciprocity has taken hold, the guilt of non-repayment becomes unbearable. People convince themselves that service isn't just expected, it's the only moral response. And that's how freedom gets traded for duty, willingly but under invisible strings. When you really step back, the setup begins to look less like a relationship of love, and more like an unhealthy contract that no one remembers signing. A contract where the terms are written entirely by one side, enforced through fear, and justified through guilt. Think about how relationships work in healthy human life. If someone helps you, you might feel grateful, but you still remain free. You don't become their servant. You don't give them ownership over your choices, your future, or your body. Gratitude has a natural shelf life. You thank them, maybe return the favor at some point, and then the balance resets. Both sides move forward as equals. But religion doesn't allow that reset. It insists the debt is permanent. The message isn't be thankful, it's spend your life proving you're thankful. That difference is massive. It changes a one-time act of kindness into a lifetime of control. And this is where the logic begins to eat itself. Because if a gift is supposed to be unconditional, then why is there a condition attached? The contradiction is obvious, but it's often hidden under layers of emotional rhetoric. Sermons frame it as love so overwhelming that obedience is the only natural response. Music and worship services are designed to stir up feelings of awe and surrender. Entire communities reinforce the idea that devotion is not just a choice, but a duty. And when every emotional lever is pulled at once, critical thinking slips quietly out the back door. Sociologists have studied how systems of power keep people compliant. One key tool is what's called indebtedness. Framing. This is when a leader or system convinces you that your very existence depends on them, so you owe them everything. It shows up in abusive relationships when a partner says, "I'm the only one who puts up with you, you'd be nothing without me." It shows up in authoritarian regimes when a dictator says, "I gave you stability, so you must obey me." And it shows up in religion when the line is drawn that says, "He saved you, therefore you must serve." The logic works because it taps into shame, and shame is one of the most powerful social tools humans know. Unlike guilt, which is about something you did, shame is about who you are. When religion frames your very identity as sinful, unworthy, and broken, the gift of salvation feels like it touches the deepest part of your being. That's what makes it so hard to question, because doubting the debt feels like doubting your worth. And yet, when you look at it clearly, the whole structure starts to look deeply manipulative. Let's put it in practical terms. If someone knocked on your door, handed you a box, and said, "Inside is a gift, but if you accept it, you must serve me for the rest of your life," would you call that generosity? Or would you recognize it as coercion dressed up as kindness? The unsettling part is that this tactic has been refined for centuries. It's not just an accidental quirk of theology, it's a feature, a design. Early church leaders understood that the promise of salvation could bind people in ways no army ever could. You can't chain millions of people with metal, but you can chain them with obligation, guilt, and fear of what happens if they walk away. And so, the idea that gratitude must become servitude was not just preached, it was enforced. Even today you hear it in the small moments. A parent telling their child that questioning faith dishonors the sacrifice of Jesus. A preacher warning that half-hearted devotion is a slap in the face to the cross. A worship song that repeats, "You gave it all for me, so I give it all for you." These aren't harmless phrases. They are psychological hooks designed to reinforce the debt and the duty. And the more they are repeated, the deeper they sink. But what does this do to the human spirit? When people live under the weight of constant obligation, they lose sight of the difference between gratitude and slavery. They begin to accept that love must always come with chains, that kindness must always demand repayment, and that obedience is the only true way to show loyalty. That's not love. That's control disguised as devotion. When an idea like, "serve him because he saved you," lives at the center of someone's thinking, it doesn't just stay in the abstract. It bleeds into the way they see themselves and the way they treat other people. Take the family setting. A child is taught from the earliest years that obedience isn't optional. It's the proper way to show gratitude. They hear that they were saved from hell, that Jesus died for them, and therefore their little life is already a debt. Before they even form their own sense of self, they're told that who they are is already tied to service. And what happens when a child grows up believing that their worth comes only through serving someone else? They become primed to accept unfair treatment, to stay silent in situations where they should speak up, and to confuse love with submission. This kind of conditioning can create adults who struggle to set boundaries. People who feel guilty for saying no, even when saying yes would harm them. People who stay in toxic marriages because they've been taught that sacrifice is the highest form of love. People who let institutions or leaders exploit them because somewhere deep down, they believe that service is the only way to prove their loyalty. You can see this in religious communities too. Leaders constantly remind their congregations that everything they have is owed to God, and by extension, to the church. Volunteers are pressured to give their time, their energy, their money, often beyond what they can afford, because it's presented not as a request, but as a repayment plan. He gave his life, so how can you not give a few hours, a few dollars? That logic is repeated so often that people stop questioning it, and soon, the line between generosity and exploitation disappears. Even outside the walls of the church, this mindset has ripple effects. Think about how politics is influenced by religious reasoning. If citizens are trained from childhood to accept authority because they owe it to someone higher, how much easier is it for them to accept leaders who demand loyalty in the name of morality? The habit of confusing gratitude with servitude doesn't just shape faith, it shapes culture. Entire societies can normalize submission if the logic goes unchallenged. And there's another layer here. When you're told that your service is owed because of a past act of salvation, the past becomes a tool of control over the present. It means you can never move on, never say, "Thank you, that's enough." The debt is eternal, stretching across your whole life, which means freedom is always just out of reach. There are countless personal stories that illustrate this. Adults who grew up in strict religious homes often talk about the crushing weight of obligation. They describe how every doubt felt like betrayal, every small desire for independence felt like spitting on the cross. One person shared how, when they struggled with depression, they were told they weren't grateful enough to God, as if their mental health was proof of ingratitude. That's the poison of this logic. Instead of receiving compassion, they were given guilt. Instead of freedom, they were told to serve harder. It's not hard to see how damaging this becomes. Gratitude, when genuine, heals and connects. But gratitude under compulsion corrodes. It warps into resentment, self-loathing, and quiet despair. And yet, because the system labels any hesitation as rebellion, people hide those feelings, layering guilt on top of guilt. It becomes a cycle that grinds down individuality until only obedience is left. And when a system depends on obedience above all else, love becomes irrelevant. You can't tell whether someone's devotion is sincere when they're told it's the only acceptable option. Real love requires freedom. The freedom to walk away, the freedom to say no, the freedom to define your own limits. Strip that away, and what's left isn't love. It's servitude dressed up in holy language. When you look at history, it becomes clear that the idea of owing service because of salvation wasn't just a personal teaching. It became a system-wide strategy. Early church leaders faced a problem. How do you bind people together in loyalty strong enough to survive persecution, political upheaval, and cultural resistance? They needed something deeper than community rituals or inspiring speeches. They needed a story that would reach into the heart of every individual and tie them to the institution itself. That's where the salvation debt logic came in. The message was simple but powerful. God saved you, and now you owe him. But because God is invisible, the repayment had to take visible form. And where was that repayment directed? To the church, to its leaders, its rituals, its demands. Suddenly, gratitude wasn't just a feeling, it was a lifelong duty, monitored and measured by the institution that claimed to speak for God. We can see this in the way tithing was justified. People were told that giving a portion of their income wasn't just generosity, it was an obligation, a return payment on the salvation they had already received. Over time, this shifted from voluntary to mandatory, enforced through fear of spiritual consequences. And the more this debt logic spread, the wealthier and more powerful the church became. Think about the Middle Ages. Entire populations were kept in line, not just through political force, but through theological debt. The idea that you owed God everything was expanded into practices like indulgences. People were told that their sins, the debt of their soul, could be reduced if they gave money, built cathedrals, funded crusades. Salvation was not only about service, but also about financial repayment. And because questioning this meant risking eternal punishment, people complied. Even rulers played into this logic. Kings claimed divine right, insisting their authority was part of God's plan. To serve the king was to serve God, and to resist was to betray the salvation you supposedly owed. It was a neat merging of theology and politics, where obedience to religious authority translated directly into obedience to political power. And let's not forget the fear of hell that always lurked behind the gratitude. Gratitude sounds warm and noble, but in practice it was backed by the threat of eternal consequences. If you don't serve, if you don't repay the debt, the punishment is unthinkable. So, the gratitude was never free. It was gratitude with a gun at your back. What's striking is how effective this strategy was. It allowed the church to grow from a fringe movement into one of the most dominant forces in human history. Not through armies alone, not through pure philosophy, but through psychological leverage. By convincing people that they owed something they could never fully repay, the institution secured generations of loyalty, labor, and wealth. And the same message echoes today. Modern sermons may not talk about indulgences, but they repeat the same core idea. You were saved, therefore you owe service. Modern megachurches may not demand allegiance to kings, but they demand allegiance to pastors and their vision. The wrapping changes, but the logic remains. A debt you didn't agree to, stretched into an eternity of obligation. When you trace it through history, you begin to see how much this idea shaped not just religion, but society itself. It set patterns for how people relate to power, how they understand obligation, and how they confuse gratitude with submission. And those patterns are still alive, still influencing the way people think about morality, loyalty, and freedom. The human mind isn't built to carry infinite debt. In everyday life, we feel relief when debts are paid off. You clear a loan, you return a favor, you settle accounts. There's a sense of closure, but in the logic of salvation, closure is impossible. The debt is eternal. You can never do enough, never serve enough, never give enough to balance the scales. And that leaves people living under a permanent weight. This shows up in the psychology of guilt. Guilt, in small doses, can push people to repair relationships or correct mistakes. But when guilt is constant, it becomes corrosive. A person who wakes up every day believing they already owe more than they can ever give lives in a state of exhaustion. They measure themselves against an impossible standard and always come up short. Perfectionism grows in that soil. People internalize the idea that every action must prove gratitude. Every prayer, every thought, every behavior is judged against the question, am I serving enough? And since no human being can ever live up to divine perfection, the answer is always no, which means guilt multiplies, feeding back into the cycle. Serve harder, fail, feel guilty, serve harder again. It never ends. This cycle doesn't just harm individuals, it shapes entire communities. In some churches, people compete quietly with one another, each trying to outserve the rest. Who volunteers more hours? Who gives more money? Who sings louder? Who sacrifices more? It creates an atmosphere where worth is measured not by compassion or honesty, but by performance. And beneath the surface, resentment and burnout grow. Psychologists studying religious trauma have noted how deeply this cycle cuts. People who leave high-control faiths often describe years of feeling worthless, even after walking away. That's because the debt logic doesn't disappear overnight. It's been wired into the brain, reinforced through sermons, songs, and community pressure. You might stop believing in the theology, but the emotional reflex lingers. You still feel guilty for not serving enough, still feel a strange weight when you say no, still flinch at the idea of freedom. What's more, this kind of system makes people vulnerable to manipulation in other parts of life. If you've been conditioned to accept that love means service and that gratitude means surrender, then it's easier for toxic bosses, partners, or leaders to exploit you. You already carry the mental pattern. You already feel that if someone gives you something, you must give back more than you can afford. And so, the chains of religion can echo long after the faith itself is gone. And here's something rarely talked about. Living under this logic can also create hidden anger. On the surface, people present devotion, joy, and willingness. But deep down, the endless demand breeds resentment, because no one enjoys a relationship where nothing is ever enough. That quiet anger is often turned inward, producing shame, or it's projected outward onto others, onto family, onto outsiders, onto anyone who questions the system. That's one reason why religious communities can sometimes be both outwardly kind and inwardly harsh. The pressure has to go somewhere. When gratitude is genuine, it creates joy. But when gratitude is forced, it becomes a cage. And when the cage is disguised as love, it takes years, sometimes decades, for people to even realize they're trapped. One of the strangest outcomes of this logic is how it reshapes the idea of morality. In a normal setting, morality is about actions and their consequences. Did you harm someone? Did you help someone? Were you honest, fair, compassionate? But under the weight of religious debt, morality gets rewritten. It's no longer about the natural impact of your choices. It's about how well you serve. This means obedience is elevated above everything else. The highest moral act becomes loyalty, not kindness. The worst moral failure becomes rebellion, not cruelty. That's why someone can be generous, caring, and honest, but still be labeled sinful if they don't bend their knee. And why someone can be cold, selfish, even abusive, yet still be praised if they are obedient to the system. Service to God replaces service to people. And so, the moral compass tilts away from reality and toward authority. You see this clearly in communities where devotion is measured more by rituals than by empathy. Missing a church service can feel more sinful than neglecting a struggling neighbor. Questioning doctrine can seem worse than mistreating your own family. Because the system isn't asking, "Are you good?" It's asking, "Are you loyal?" And when loyalty is confused with goodness, corruption finds cover. Leaders can demand anything under the banner of service. Entire institutions can excuse injustice because obedience takes priority. History gives us countless examples of this. Wars waged in the name of God, justified not by compassion, but by the logic of service. Oppression defended because it was framed as obedience to divine will. Harm excused because questioning authority was seen as worse than the harm itself. The problem here isn't just abstract. It shapes how people think about everyday choices. Someone might feel more guilty about skipping prayer than about lying to a friend, more guilty about missing a tithe payment than about mistreating an employee. That's what happens when morality gets tied to debt repayment instead of human flourishing. Psychologists studying moral development talk about the difference between external and internal morality. External morality is when rules and authority dictate what's right. Internal morality is when you develop empathy, reason, and responsibility that guide your actions. The "serve him because he saved you" framework locks people into external morality. It keeps them dependent on authority for direction instead of growing their own ethical compass. And the result is moral immaturity dressed up as devotion. But it goes deeper still, because when people believe they are forever indebted, they're willing to rationalize almost anything as service. They can be persuaded to give up their resources, their autonomy, even their dignity, because they think that's what repayment requires. And when enough people share that mindset, whole societies tilt toward control rather than freedom. Obedience is celebrated, questioning is punished, and genuine compassion becomes secondary. This distortion reveals a truth that's hard to say out loud. The logic of "serve him because he saved you" doesn't just damage individuals. It corrupts the very meaning of good and evil. It takes the most beautiful parts of human life, gratitude, kindness, love, and twists them into tools of control. And once that shift happens, people stop asking whether something is truly good. They only ask whether it looks like service. When you start looking at institutions through this lens, the effects are everywhere. Organizations built on the idea that service equals virtue can seem noble on the surface, even when they cause damage underneath. Take churches, for example. The outward appearance is often generosity, community, and charity. And on some level, that's true. People donate, volunteer, and help one another. But the underlying logic, that loyalty is owed because of salvation, changes everything. Donations aren't just generosity, they're repayment. Volunteer work isn't just kindness, it's proof of devotion. And that can allow leaders to exploit followers while keeping the moral narrative intact. Charities influenced by similar religious logic sometimes show the same pattern. When aid is conditional on participation in religious programs, or when recipients are told that help is a reward for obedience, the power dynamics shift. The people giving aid hold leverage, and gratitude becomes a tool of control rather than a human exchange of support. Even politics isn't immune. Leaders can frame obedience and loyalty as morally superior, drawing on religious language to justify laws, policies, and cultural norms. Citizens are encouraged to equate service to authority with virtue and questioning that authority with sin. In this context, the serve because saved mindset supports systems that concentrate power while presenting themselves as righteous. History is full of striking examples. Monarchs and rulers leverage religious loyalty to consolidate power. Crusades, inquisitions, and religious wars were often justified as acts of service to God, framing obedience as the highest moral duty. The logic allowed atrocities to be carried out while still maintaining the appearance of righteousness. People believed they were serving the divine, and that belief made them complicit in acts that were objectively harmful. Even in modern times, the same pattern emerges in subtler ways. Megachurches, religious schools, and faith-based charities often rely on volunteer labor, donations, and unquestioning support, framed as repayment for salvation. Leaders who question or challenge them are sometimes branded as morally inferior, regardless of their actions or character. And followers internalize the message: service above all, obedience as virtue, loyalty as proof of goodness. The danger is that this logic shields the institution from accountability. If the moral standard is serving the saved God, then any criticism can be reframed as selfishness, ingratitude, or rebellion. That protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable. And because humans are wired to avoid guilt and shame, most people comply quietly, even when the rules harm them or others. It also creates a culture where harm is normalized if it appears to serve the divine purpose. People justify suffering, oppression, and sacrifice in the name of service. And because the moral compass is tied to loyalty rather than outcomes, very little real-world evaluation happens. The world becomes a place where devotion matters more than justice, obedience more than empathy, and proof of gratitude more than human flourishing. And that's the ultimate toxicity of this logic. It doesn't just manipulate individuals, it shapes communities, economies, governments, and culture itself. The promise of salvation becomes a chain that extends far beyond the individual, wrapping society in a framework where freedom, critical thinking, and genuine moral evaluation are all secondary to service. Walking away from this logic isn't as simple as rejecting the theology. Even after someone stops believing, the framework of debt often lingers. It's like taking off chains only to realize the marks are still on your skin. People who leave often describe a strange emptiness at first, not because they've lost something real, but because their entire sense of identity was tied to service. For years, maybe decades, their value was measured in how much they gave, how loyal they appeared, how obedient they were. Once that's gone, they're left asking questions that feel almost too big. Who am I without this debt? What does gratitude look like when it's no longer demanded? How do I know if I'm good without someone else telling me what service requires? The guilt doesn't vanish overnight either. Many ex-believers say that even when their minds reject the theology, their emotions still carry the reflex. They feel waves of guilt when they rest instead of working, when they choose themselves instead of others, when they say no without apology. The logic of "you owe everything" has been pressed into their nervous system, and it takes time to untangle. Some describe it like muscle memory. For so long, the automatic response was to serve, to obey, to sacrifice. So even when freedom is possible, the body moves back into old patterns. They overextend themselves, feel guilty for having boundaries, or silence their own doubts out of habit. Recovery is about retraining those instincts, and that can take years. But there's another side to this. Once the fog clears, many people describe a rush of clarity. They begin to see how unhealthy the old framework was, how much of their life was shaped by fear disguised as gratitude. They start experimenting with what real freedom feels like. Gratitude that comes naturally, not from obligation. Service that comes from compassion, not debt. Love that isn't tied to fear of punishment or demand for repayment. The process is messy. Some swing hard in the other direction, avoiding all forms of commitment or service because they fear being trapped again. Others struggle with anger, realizing how much of their life was stolen by a logic that never truly made sense. But over time, patterns emerge. People rediscover autonomy, build healthier relationships, and learn to tell the difference between genuine kindness and manipulation. And here's the striking part. Many who leave say they become more compassionate, not less. Without the weight of forced service, they find themselves helping others because they want to, not because they're told to. They discover that real morality, the kind rooted in empathy and shared humanity, feels lighter, more natural, and more sustainable than the endless grind of debt repayment. In that sense, stepping away isn't just escape, it's reclamation, reclaiming the ability to define goodness without fear, reclaiming gratitude as something beautiful rather than burdensome, reclaiming love as a choice instead of a chain. The shadow of the old logic doesn't disappear overnight, but the very fact that people can heal from it shows something important. The human spirit isn't built to thrive under endless debt. It longs for freedom, authenticity, and relationships where gratitude flows naturally instead of being demanded. And once that's rediscovered, the old mantra, "serve him because he saved you," begins to sound less like love and more like the trap it always was. It would be tempting to think that this debt-driven logic was mostly a thing of the past, a relic of medieval sermons, dusty cathedrals, and old authority structures. But if you pay attention to the language of modern churches, it's still right there. Only now, it's wrapped in slick production, catchy music, and emotionally charged storytelling. Contemporary worship music, for instance, is saturated with this theme. Lyrics repeat the message over and over. You gave everything for me, so I give everything for you. You saved my soul, so I surrender my life. The music is designed to bypass critical thought, stirring emotion until people feel the weight of debt without ever naming it outright. It's less a song and more a form of reinforcement. Gratitude framed as obligation, sung into the subconscious week after week. Christian books and media echo the same pattern. Best-selling devotionals often remind readers that their lives are not their own, that every breath belongs to God because of salvation. The message is dressed up as inspiration, but the undertone is always duty, not gratitude freely given, but gratitude demanded. And because it's repeated in polished, encouraging tones, it's harder to spot as manipulation. Preachers too lean heavily on this framework. Sermons about sacrifice, commitment, and devotion nearly always circle back to the same justification. Look at what he did for you. If you hesitate to give, to serve, to obey, you're told to remember the cross. The argument is rarely logical. It's emotional. It uses guilt as a shortcut to obedience. Even youth ministries target children with this idea. Kids are told from an early age that Jesus died for them, personally, and the only right response is to live their lives in a service. For a child, that's an overwhelming weight. They don't yet understand metaphor, nuance, or theology. They only understand that someone died because of them, and that they now owe everything. That kind of messaging leaves a deep mark, shaping how they view responsibility, guilt, and love for the rest of their lives. Social media has amplified all of this. Bite-sized quotes, short clips of sermons, and emotionally charged reels reinforce the same narrative. He gave it all. How could you give him less? The format may be modern, but the core is ancient, the old indebtedness wrapped in new packaging. And because it's everywhere, from songs to Instagram posts, the message becomes background noise, always present, always shaping, rarely questioned. The result is a culture where believers internalize the idea that devotion is never optional, never truly voluntary. It's not framed as, you can serve if you want. It's framed as, you must serve, or you're ungrateful. That subtle shift makes all the difference. It turns service into a test of loyalty rather than an act of love. And here's what makes it so effective today. The system no longer needs to use fear as openly as it once did. The modern believer isn't always threatened with hellfire in every sermon. Instead, they're saturated with gratitude rhetoric. The fear still lurks in the background, but the foreground is carefully polished inspiration. Smiles, lights, music, emotional highs. It feels like love, but underneath it's still obligation. This modern packaging doesn't change the core problem. In fact, it makes it harder to challenge, because when people raise concerns, they're told, "Why are you being so negative? Look how beautiful this is. Look how much love it shows." But beauty can hide manipulation, and love, when twisted into duty, loses its very essence. The old contract still stands. The same invisible debt is still preached, only now it's sung into arenas, streamed into headphones, and posted as hashtags. The toxic logic hasn't gone away. It's simply evolved to fit a culture of media saturation, and that means it reaches more people, more subtly, more effectively than ever before. The thing about ideas is that they rarely stay in the box they're handed to you in. A teaching that begins in a religious context often spills into the rest of life, quietly shaping the way people think and act in areas that have nothing to do with church. Take relationships. If you've been raised to believe that love always comes with a debt, then you're more likely to fall into relationships where your worth is measured by how much you give, not who you are. You might overextend yourself, staying with partners who drain you because somewhere deep down, you believe sacrifice is the price of love. The phrase "serve him because he saved you" becomes, in practice, serve them because they need you. And boundaries become difficult, even unthinkable. The same logic shows up in careers. People who grew up under constant obligation often feel guilty about pursuing ambition or rest. They see work not just as a way to provide, but as a form of proving worth. Burnout becomes common because the mindset is always tilted toward doing more, giving more, never feeling that enough is enough. Gratitude in the workplace gets twisted into the same loop. The company gave me this job, so I owe them endless loyalty. It mirrors the same unhealthy contract, just under a different name. Even in friendships, the pattern can play out. Someone raised in this system might struggle to accept help without immediately trying to repay it. They feel uncomfortable with genuine generosity because they've been conditioned to think every gift carries strings. So, instead of enjoying mutual support, they turn relationships into invisible ledgers of debt and repayment. And at the core of all this is self-worth. If you've been told your value comes from serving because of what was done for you, then you don't learn how to value yourself intrinsically. You learn to see yourself as a debtor, someone who must constantly justify existence through action. That means rest feels like laziness, self-care feels like selfishness, and autonomy feels like rebellion. People internalize the belief that they are never enough on their own, only enough in relation to how much they serve. This is one of the most insidious parts of the logic, because it doesn't just influence religious devotion, it seeps into how people see the entire structure of their lives. They may not realize that the guilt they feel when saying no to a friend, or the exhaustion they feel when pushing themselves at work, is connected to the old narrative of eternal debt. But the echoes are there. And the irony is that this constant sense of owing makes people less effective, not more. A person who serves out of guilt eventually burns out. A person who gives without boundaries eventually resents. A person who cannot rest eventually breaks. And yet, the system presents this collapse as further proof that you weren't serving enough, rather than recognizing the flaw in the logic itself. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that keeps people from ever finding balance. When you trace these patterns, it becomes clear that the phrase "serve him because he saved you" isn't just a theological statement. It's a worldview, a lens through which people are taught to see themselves and others, a lens that quietly redefines love, work, community, and morality in ways that eat away at freedom and dignity. And until that lens is questioned, people often can't even imagine another way of living. They can't imagine gratitude that doesn't demand repayment, love that doesn't require chains, or worth that doesn't need to be proven. But those things exist. They've always existed outside the walls of the system. It just takes courage to see them. To really see the problem, it helps to set the toxic logic side by side with the real thing. Genuine gratitude versus manufactured debt. Genuine love versus coerced service. The differences are striking once you notice them. True gratitude is spontaneous. It arises naturally when someone helps you, when they show kindness without demand. You feel it because the act was free, unforced, given without strings. And because it's free, your response is also free. Maybe you give back, maybe you don't. But whatever you do, it's your choice. That's what makes it meaningful. Now, compare that with the religious version. You're told that the gift of salvation demands a lifetime of repayment. Gratitude isn't optional, it's mandatory. The moment someone tells you how to prove gratitude, it stops being gratitude and becomes obligation. The act loses authenticity because it's no longer about your heart. It's about their control. The same is true of love. Real love can't be demanded. It can't be bought, forced, or leveraged. It's valuable precisely because it's chosen freely. When a parent cares for a child out of love, it's not because they are tallying a score. When a friend stands by you, it's not because you owe them. The beauty of love is that it can walk away at any time, but chooses not to. Religion's version twists that. He saved you, therefore you must love him. That's not love. That's emotional blackmail. The phrase itself destroys the very thing it claims to honor, because love under compulsion isn't love at all. It's servitude with a smile painted over it. Think about it in human terms. If someone you know constantly reminded you, "Remember what I did for you. You owe me. Prove you love me by serving me," you'd recognize it as manipulation. You'd probably call the relationship unhealthy. Yet, when the same pattern is framed in religious terms, it's called devotion. The double standard is staggering. And here's the deeper problem. When people are raised to believe that this twisted form of gratitude and love is normal, they lose sight of what the real versions feel like. They confuse duty with devotion, guilt with gratitude, fear with love. It creates generations of people who may never fully experience what authentic relationships look like, because their baseline was set inside a system of conditional acceptance. But when people finally break free, many describe the shock of experiencing the genuine article for the first time. Gratitude that feels light instead of heavy. Love that feels safe instead of suffocating. Service that comes from compassion instead of debt. It's almost overwhelming because it's so different from what they were taught. And it reveals the truth that deep down, humans were never meant to live under eternal obligation. This contrast is important because it shows that the alternative isn't emptiness. The alternative isn't coldness or selfishness. The alternative is a fuller, freer version of the very things religion claims to provide. Gratitude without chains, love without blackmail, morality without fear. Those things don't require the toxic logic at all. In fact, they flourish better without it. The more you look at it, the more it becomes clear that the whole system survives on confusion. It works only if people can't tell the difference between real gratitude and forced repayment, between real love and coerced service, between a free gift and an eternal obligation. That blurring isn't accidental, it's carefully maintained. Sermons talk about salvation as a free gift, but then quickly move to what you must do in response. Songs declare unconditional love, but the chorus always circles back to what you owe. Pastors remind people that grace cannot be earned, but then turn around and outline all the ways you must prove yourself worthy of it. The contradiction is obvious, but repetition dulls the edge. Over time, people stop noticing the shift. They accept the contradiction as if it were natural. This confusion is the foundation, because if people realize that a true gift requires nothing in return, the whole logic would collapse. If they saw clearly that coerced love is not love, the system would lose its moral leverage. If they recognized that gratitude only matters when it's free, the constant demand for service would be exposed for what it is. But instead, believers are taught to live inside the tension, to accept paradox as mystery, to dismiss their own discomfort as weakness. The unease they feel is explained away as spiritual immaturity or even sin. So they push it down, silence it, and tell themselves that endless obligation is normal. And that's why breaking free often begins not with rejecting belief outright, but with noticing the cracks. Someone realizes that their gratitude doesn't feel genuine anymore. It feels forced. Someone notices that love feels more like fear. Someone wonders why a gift requires so much repayment. Those small questions are like light seeping into a dark room. Once seen, they're hard to unsee. That's the key. The moment you recognize the difference between real and counterfeit, the spell begins to break. You start to see that real gratitude lifts you, while counterfeit gratitude weighs you down. That real love makes you free, while counterfeit love binds you tighter. That real gifts don't demand repayment, while counterfeit gifts come with endless strings. And when you see that clearly, you begin to understand why the mantra, "serve him because he saved you," has survived so long. Not because it's true, but because it's useful. Useful for keeping people obedient, useful for sustaining institutions, useful for ensuring loyalty. It's not about love, it's about leverage. Recognizing this doesn't erase the years of conditioning overnight. The reflexes remain, the guilt lingers, the habits take time to unlearn, but the recognition is enough to start the unraveling, to begin rebuilding a sense of self outside of debt, outside of obligation, outside of fear. And in that rebuilding, people rediscover what gratitude and love were meant to be all along. When people finally step away from the debt logic, the journey forward is often long, but it's also deeply liberating. Because for the first time, they're free to rebuild their lives on foundations that aren't rooted in guilt and obligation. It usually begins with small shifts, learning to say no without drowning in guilt, allowing themselves to rest without feeling lazy, accepting kindness without rushing to repay it. These may seem like minor steps, but for someone whose whole life has been shaped by the weight of obligation, they're revolutionary. Over time, morality itself takes on new meaning. No longer tied to obedience, it begins to flow from empathy, reason, and real human connection. Goodness becomes less about what authority demands and more about what helps, what heals, what makes life better for others. This shift is powerful because it reveals that morality was never dependent on divine debt to begin with. It was always within human capacity, waiting to be claimed. Love also transforms. No longer a duty, it becomes a choice again. And when love is free, it's far richer. You can finally know whether someone is with you because they want to be, not because they owe you. And you can finally give love without fear that it will be twisted into obligation. That kind of love is more fragile, yes, because it requires freedom, but it's also more genuine because it's real. Gratitude, too, is reclaimed. Once the chains are gone, people rediscover what it feels like to be thankful without pressure, to appreciate kindness because it's given freely, not because it's tied to fear. And that kind of gratitude doesn't demand repayment. It inspires generosity. It creates a cycle of kindness rooted not in obligation, but in joy. And perhaps the most important shift is in self-worth. People begin to see that they are not debtors, not broken creatures who must spend their lives repaying a cosmic balance sheet. They are human beings, valuable in their own right, capable of love and goodness without someone holding leverage over them. That realization changes everything. It doesn't mean the old reflexes vanish completely. The whispers of guilt may return, the old scripts may replay in the mind. But over time, those voices lose power. They're recognized for what they always were, tools of control. And once seen clearly, they no longer define who you are. That's why exposing the toxic logic of serve him because he saved you matters. Because as long as it goes unchallenged, it warps gratitude into guilt, love into duty, morality into obedience. It steals the most beautiful parts of human life and uses them as chains. But once it's named for what it is, people can begin to break those chains. And the beauty of breaking them is this. On the other side, gratitude, love, and morality don't disappear. They become stronger, more authentic, more human. They no longer belong to an institution or an authority. They belong to you. And in that freedom, the words change. No more serve because you owe. Instead, choose because you want to. No more prove your gratitude. Instead, feel it when it's real. No more love because you're forced. Instead, love because you are free. And that difference makes all the difference.